Good evening, everyone. I've never been at a NERA conference before, but I've known about NERA for, gosh, since 1966 or somewhere in there. I graduated from Dartmouth College in 1964, and Vilhjalmur Stephenson, who is a famous Arctic explorer, was in residence at the time at Dartmouth. And my professor Elmer Harp was there, and both of them had been involved in some of the early formation of NERA. And then there was a long period where NERA sort of went into a hyperdiffusion mode and was not thought in really great graces, by archaeologists, at least by the professional archaeologists. But it's been an amazing turnaround that you folks have made, and we're now, looking forward to having I'm looking forward to having a continuing relationship with you folks. You're doing some of the most wonderful work in New England. You're doing the kind of archaeology the professional archaeologists have stopped doing, which is looking into interesting questions. The field has got so specialized that it's really, most of the people who are employed in universities are working with technical, DNA or new technologies and things like that. And so I think it's really going to be important in the future that organizations like this collaborate with the universities and the professional people who continue to do dirt archaeology. And, that means both looking at the rocks like you guys are specializing in, as well as excavation projects and things, because for one thing, you need to connect with the local communities that you're working in. And I can see that you're very much involved in that with the work you do. You're doing tremendous outreach activities. Your field programs and everything are really great. And the problem that the professional archaeologists have had for the last 20 years is they've kind of stepped away from a lot of field work in different areas of the country, is that they're losing touch with the communities that need to support them with Congress and NSF and budgets and so forth. So it's really important that you continue the trajectory you're on now. And I really applaud it. And I'm just amazed how much good work is going on here and how much you guys are bringing into the field from all these different fields that you come from. So tonight I was going to try to pick up a little bit on the idea that NERA has been involved in terms of the looking at how peoples have come to North America in different directions and things like that. So I picked the Argonaut idea because I've been sort of involved in that kind of work. I got to the Smithsonian after my college degree. At Dartmouth, I went to Harvard for 4 years, and then I was very lucky to get a job at the Smithsonian. And I've spent my whole career there doing a lot of different things, continuing my archaeology in the north, particularly initially for 20 years or more in Labrador, then in Mongolia and in northern Russia, and looking at gradually I started off in Goose Bay and central Labrador coast with prehistory, and looking at the Eskimo Indian fluctuations as those cultures developed across the boreal forest and tundra regions. And we had quite a lot of students involved, and after we probably figured out about 8,000 or 9,000 years of prehistory. But one thing that hadn't been resolved is how did the Inuit get to Labrador? And that led me to Alaska, where the Smithsonian has lots of collections. And so I started looking into the history and the cultures of Alaska. I did a big exhibit on cultures of the North Pacific with the Russians, using Russian collections and Smithsonian collections. Then I got into Mongolia, and because that's really the origin of where a lot of the Eskimo or Inuit people genetically arise from. So I spent almost 20 years working on archaeology and rock art archaeology in Mongolia. And so I sort of developed this special interest in the peopling of the circumpolar region. How did they get there? How did they develop? How did peoples and ideas move around in the circumpolar area? I'm not going to talk about that kind of stuff, tonight with you. I'm going to more focus on on the North Atlantic and some of the crazy ideas that were popular and some of the ideas that still haven't been figured out. So we're going to look at a bunch of different issues and sites and ideas and try to assess what kind of contexts were happening, what seems to be true, what seems to be false, and what remains to be figured out. So this is the coast of Labrador up in the northern Torngat areas where we worked for quite a few years. Really beautiful country north of the tree line. We'll talk a little bit about Ramah chert, I guess. This is sort of a review of some of the things we'll discuss quite briefly. Most of them, Oak Island in Nova Scotia, and Dennis Stanford. Some of you know about his Paleoatlantic ideas. Ertebolle culture, which was the Danish culture, which Alice Kehoe proposed and come across the Atlantic and created the foundation for Vignette pottery. Then the Scandinavia Stone Age, in which we had some very interesting ground stone technologies and maritime technologies that were very similar to things we found in the maritime archaic cultures of Newfoundland and Labrador. A bit about stone chambers, the Kensington stone, and a few other things, and so forth. So it's a fairly large task that we have, and so get started here. So Oak Island is a pretty amazing place. Have anybody been to Oak Island? Yeah, well, I had not read up on too much of it till the other day. I sort of looked into it a bit more, and it's got an amazing history going on for over 200 years. People have been claiming that there's something hidden down in Oak Island, in Oak Island, and there's been a lot of very big investments and a lot of important people like Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was a sponsor of it at one point, and Errol Flynn and William Astor and others, Richard Byrd. So quite an early mystery, which has never really been. Nothing has been found. A lot of people lost their lives. A lot of people lost their money and so forth. But it just shows you the fascination that people have had with history and the challenge of trying to discover stuff about the past. This is the Ertebolle material. This is the pot on the left from Ertebolle site, and then some Vignette 1 pottery. Alice Kehoe got her degree at Harvard, and she's a brilliant lady who's reached pretty much toward the end of her career now. But she published articles about people coming across the Atlantic, small boats across the North Atlantic. There's one of her article titles, and she proposed that people actually were making a direct connection by sea across the northern oceans, the North Atlantic oceans. And at the time, they didn't have Ertebolle pottery dated exactly. Now we know that it's probably 6,000 years earlier than Vignette 1, and there don't seem to be that many similarities anyway. But she has to be credited with the idea that before the Norse came, that people actually could manage to cross the North Atlantic. And if you look at the lands, it's not that far. There's not more than 500 or 600 miles between all the lands in the North Atlantic to get across via Iceland and Greenland and down into New England. But it was it stimulated a lot of discussion. A lot of people thought it was crazy, and they know it's not correct now. More recently, my colleague Dennis Stanford has been who started off as a Paleoindian archaeologist working in the Great Plains. He did his PhD dissertation working with Eskimos in Alaska and got familiar with their skin boat technology and how they could hunt whales and manage in icy seas and so forth. And he transferred that idea to the North Atlantic because he started finding so many Clovis points in the Chesapeake Bay region that he thought there must have been a huge population there at one point, most of it underwater now or eroded away. And he got together with Bruce Bradley, and they produced this wonderful book, which is based on the idea that people from the Solutrean around 16,000 years ago crossed the North Atlantic and arrived in the Northeast. It was based on very slim evidence, based on some what they call overshot flaking technology, and the Sinmar find from the off the coast of Virginia and Delaware, where they found a bipoint near an elephant tusk that was dragged up by a fisherman. And so they went back to Spain and looked at the Solutrean collections and so forth. He got a lot of criticism from a professional archaeology society for this, because partly they were concerned that this seemed to indicate that maybe, Europeans were responsible for founding American Indians in North America, which is completely false from DNA and other data that we have, and so forth. But he pursued the idea because one of the concepts was that if you had a skin boat, you could travel around the ice edge in the North Atlantic at the end of the Paleolithic without too much trouble, because the ice is very damps the sea swells. And so, as I have found traveling in Labrador in similar conditions, you have a very calm weather, calm seas if you're in among the broken ice at the edge of the ice fields and so forth. But anyway, it was a brave idea to throw out there, and he always meant it as a hypothesis, and I think it's going to be proven wrong. Although I think that there is a good chance that some few people may have made it across the North Atlantic, even maybe very early on. But right now we don't have evidence for that. And Dennis and Bruce published a wonderful book, which you had on the bookshelf out here now. So my work, when I began working in Labrador, one of the cultures that I discovered was I didn't discover this culture, but I found the evidence of the Maritime Archaic in Labrador. The Maritime Archaic began, further south in the coast of Maine. They call it the Red Paint People or Red Paint culture. It's a late Archaic culture that spread up the coast into Newfoundland and Labrador, and it's known especially for Jim Tuck's work in Port au Choix in the 1960s. And he found this graveyard that contained all of these wonderful skeletons, very well preserved, with all this ground slate technology, bone and harpoons, and all sorts of things, indicating that these early New England Indians, northeastern Indians, were very capable at hunting seals, walrus, and maybe even small whales. And I had gone over to Scandinavia because a very similar technology occurs in the Younger Stone Age in the Varanger areas around northern Finland and North Norway. And I wanted to compare the two collections and archaeology and see, is it possible there might have been some historical connection 4,000 to 5,000 years ago? And after studying those collections, which you see on the right-hand side of the slide here, there are a lot of technological similarities, but most of them are the result of people using similar or developing similar technology to solve the same kind of problem, which was the hunting and processing of sea mammals. Seal skins, when you're hunting a lot of seals, you need to flinge the blubber off to make seal skin garments and objects and so forth. So slate operates like a metal blade, and you can sharpen it without degrading the size of your tool or the raw material, because you just use a whetstone. So it's very similar to the kind of iron and metal technology that was developing in Asia. But it was the whole complex of the culture was different, and I realized pretty quickly that even though there were some similarities, you really had very different cultural backgrounds between them, and there was no smoking gun of connections that occurred, even though they occurred at the same time periods. So I began this work in Labrador, and after about 10 years, we had a huge project up on the north coast in the Torngat Mountains. And the picture here is of a site we dug up in the beyond the forest fringe, and it's a series of family units in a longhouse. This was never known to occur in the Maritime Archaic cultures. Everybody assumed that maritime archaic people were living like the Indians that we knew from the historical period in small teepees and tents and scattered small villages and small populations and so on. And here we had evidence of a 100-meter long house with 4-meter by 4-meter compartments with maritime archaic people living in them. And one of the reasons they were all there was because they were accessing the Ramah chert, which is this amazing quartzite material from northern Labrador that has been traded south all the way into the mid-Atlantic regions, both in the Archaic period and in the Middle Woodland period. And so we were astounded by this, and it really emphasized the fact that, these early Indian peoples had capabilities for hunting large sea mammals, for living in a very tough zone. At least in the summertime, they were traveling north to acquire and then trade Ramah chert, going into territories that were always considered to be like Eskimo-like because there was no forest for the Indians. But we figured out that they were doing this on a seasonal basis from southern areas in Labrador where they had forest cover and so forth. But it was amazing. At this one site in Iliac, we found probably 20 houses, not all occupied at the same time, but indicating that they must have had large dugout canoes. They were using soapstone. I think I have a picture of it. Maybe I don't. They were using large ground slate axes and adzes, which gouges. They're the only kind of tool you would use. Function for a tool like that would be making dugout canoes. So we knew that they were using big wooden boats, and they were making the boats in the south and taking them north to acquire this chert and trading it, very far south. A big enterprise in the late Archaic. And turned out those people are much more similar to the Northwest Coast tribes that we know historically than any of the Indian tribes that we knew historically at all in the Northeast. So there had been a huge kind of change in the cultures of the Northeast starting around 4,000 years ago when the first Paleoeskimo or Paleo-Inuit people arrived from Alaska and moved down into Labrador and cut off the maritime archaic from the source of their Ramah chert tools and so forth. So very dynamic history. So I have some of these red tags on the top of these slides indicate, what's the process going on, or what is the problem with some of these material. So misidentified as this fairly recently, Kelly's Mountain in northern Cape Breton, Nova Scotia was claimed to have been settled by Chinese, and you don't need to take a huge gasp of breath because it's so crazy that how could you even bother trying to be astonished? But anyway, this was a proposal made by somebody who has a summer house up there, and on Kelly's Mountain they found lots of these rocks that if you are traveling up to Nova Scotia or Newfoundland, I recommend you go to Kelly's Mountain and take a look around because people have been looking at rocks and rock structures very closely, and that's what this is based on. It's some road-like features. This is the reason that the Chinese came up is because Admiral Ho, around when was this in the I'm not sure exactly Admiral Ho when he was around, but
1421.
Huh?
1421.
Well, that's the name of it. That's the name of his book, and I wasn't sure exactly when they were claiming. But anyway, they had capabilities in 1421 to travel all around the Indian Ocean and explore and so forth. So some people claim that they got to the west coast of North America, and some people have said, oh, also Nova Scotia. How else would you explain these rock features and so forth? And here's some of the ones that are shown road-like, so things that look like the ground is. This is all glaciated country, so there's rocks everywhere, very little soil. But you see this one kind of road-like feature and piles of rocks which are very similar to the ones that you find here. As far as I know, there's no one who's done any. You might know because you're up in that country. Is there anybody that done any archaeology, or is this just poking around in the rocks?
Yeah, the archaeologists were brought in, and they quickly, diffused the situation. The roads were built by bulldozers in the
Ah.
50s for firefighting purposes.
Well,
Some of the other places that he identified were hydrological testing sites where they brought in heavy equipment to drill down to see where the groundwater was at. And everything is fully explained, like,
yeah.
it has no merit. In fact, I contacted Paul Chason before his book was even published and offered to go and at least have my input. He turned me down. He said, no, the book's coming out. I don't need any input. Go away.
Right. Well, thank goodness. And I didn't know that you had done that. And I looked around at the literature. I didn't see any, claims to debunk it, scientifically. So I'm glad to know that that's the case. But this is so common with the American public and the way the media works. You can make a wild claim and get it out there, and then you have a terrible time, fighting back with what the truth is and so forth. The Heavener Stone is a big, huge rock down in Oklahoma that has some Viking runes on it. It was a very early hoax that people recognized it, right away. But the Vikings have created a craze for these kind of sensational. If you want to get, if you're a person who wants to get known, you just claim you find a Viking site and you get somebody who pops it up, and then if you have a good story, it goes along for a while. So somebody just had made a fake about that. One of the most important Viking fakes is the Kensington runestone. And here's a case where the Smithsonian was deeply involved and has had a lot of trouble debunking the fact that we put it on exhibit for 2 years in 1898, I think it was, and 9. And we were pressured by Congress from the Minnesota delegation in Congress to do something that was supposed to be the most important artifact ever found in North America, which was this stone looking remarkably like a regular gravestone with carvings in it saying that Vikings came overland from Hudson Bay, and they were attacked by Indians, and they lost many of their people and so forth. It's been looked at by some folks. There's a builder in St. Paul, Minnesota, who's been promoting it, and even got a story on the History Channel about it, saying it's a genuine artifact. We know it was supposedly dug up by Olaf Ullman, who's a Swedish immigrant who came over to this country, and he says he pulled up a stump on his land in Minnesota and found this in its roots. But it's been debunked by linguists and philologists for many, many years. But it was thought to be important for a while, and once we put it on exhibit for a couple of years at the Smithsonian, against the advice of the curators, but because Congress wanted us to do it, we did it. And finally, after a couple of years, we pulled it off. And when I got to the Smithsonian, I was still answering letters from people who said, why did you take this off exhibit? It's the most important artifact ever found in North America. But it's in my office, and we had a cast made of it and so forth. But in Minnesota, the folks who had migrated there in the late 1800s, mid 1800s, really wanted something to talk about their ethnicity and their roots and so forth. And 1893, a replica to the Gokstad boat found in Norway was sailed across the Atlantic. So and it was at the World's Fair, tied up along the bank in Chicago. So a lot of people thought, hey, it is possible to sail across the Atlantic in a boat. The one down on the lower right, that's the only authentic runestone that's known in North America. That was from way up in northwestern Greenland, called the Kingasorgarak runestone, and it was found, I think, in 1824 by Eskimos who were hunting up there. It's only 5 inches long, a tiny little thing, but all the runes make sense. Most of the debunking of a lot of the runic stuff comes from people who've just copied out the runes from some publication, and they don't realize that the runes had a very specific evolutionary history, and it's very difficult for a non-linguist expert to be able to get it right, to really do a carving that is technically okay for 1025 AD or something like that. So then we got to the Vinland map. Before that, Helge Ingstad was actually a lawyer, a Norwegian lawyer who got interested in Viking history in North America. And he came over and got a boat and traveled up and down the Labrador coast and looking for where Vinland might be. And he was inspired to do this by this map on the right, which is called the Skalholt map, which dates to around 1570 and shows the world as the Viking understood the North Atlantic, which is Norway, and then to the north was various Arctic lands that went west and became this peninsula, Greenland, and then the Skalholt map showed Markland and Heliland and Vinland to the west, and Vinland the name Vinland was right at the Vinland is Winlandia. So that bird in that location at the northern tip of what had to be the northern tip of Newfoundland inspired him to go look at that particular location, and he did find the Viking site at the Lancet Meadows site. So then in the 1960s, the Vinland map was published, was discovered in Europe and bought by Yale University, and was claiming to have Vinland as an island and to show Greenland as an island. And immediately it was, Yale published a huge book, a beautiful big book on the veracity, arguing for the veracity of the Vinland map. At the time I was doing the Viking, starting to do the Viking show, and I worked with a guy who knew all about chemistry, and we went to the Yale Museum to look at the Vinland map, and he said, well, this has got to be a fake. The ink is crumbling, and we arranged to have samples studied, and it turned out the ink on the Vinland map was made with titanium dioxide, which was not used in map production or inks until the 1920s. So it was pretty clear evidence that this is a fake. Yale continued to defend it because they paid, I think, $1 million or something or other for this map, and they didn't want to have a problem with the IRS. So it wasn't until about 4 years ago, that Yale finally came through and said, we've done some exhaustive studies, and we now believe that this map is fake. So my friends were, correct right from the start. But it just shows how gullible people can be about Vinland, materials and worse materials and so forth. A rather crude, fake operation was a discovery of some hammers of Thor that came from, I think, Niantic, Connecticut, on the coast. Somebody was dredging a small cove and says they found these two bronze hammers, in the dredged spoil and so forth. And it was later discovered that they were just planted. And here's on the right is what a pretty fancy hammer of Thor that you might wear. They were worn around people's necks as, not this one, this is too a very valuable one, but simple ones were talismans and so forth. And while this was going on, this is partly because of Helge Ingstad's discovery of North America, of the Vinland site in northern Newfoundland, and so right after that, a number of these fakes had started appearing as people thought, hey, it's in the news, it's a good idea. So here's the Spirit Pond, a couple of the Spirit Pond runestones that were found in a shell heap by Walter Elliott in 1970, just after Lancet Meadows, and also been immediately debunked. The Newport Tower, some of you probably have visited the Newport Tower, a great tower in Newport, Rhode Island. And that was thought to have been built by Vikings who would have come much more south than we ever thought they might have come. But anyway, that was the claim for a long time. There was an archaeological project. A guy got a PhD in archaeology from Harvard University for digging underneath the foundations of the tower, and found, much more recent material, I think 17th, 18th century. I think it was a boot sole, which was one of the, a piece of a man's boot dating to the early colonial era. But then it was discovered that the architecture was almost identical to the Chesterton Tower in England, and so that seems to have been answered that problem pretty effectively. Here's your Stonehenge stuff, which we've seen some of these things in the last 2 days. And I put here not fully understood because I don't think I think a lot of people think that these are colonial structures. A lot of the professional archaeologists at least think that. And I think people are waiting for NERA to come up with some other solution to some of these chambers and some of these stone features, which are very difficult to deal with if you're dealing with them only from a photographic above ground kind of perspective. What's needed in most of these cases is, and it's true of a lot of the other stuff that we've seen here today. We need to do excavations. That's the way that you will find when these things actually date and what their functions was and so forth. And I hope the time has come now that young professional archaeologists can do this kind of work and maybe do it in collaboration with an organization like NERA, where you have so much information and knowledge about these structures and knowledge of a sort that the professional archaeologists are probably not going to do. You're not going to probably find somebody doing a PhD on alignments or something like that of stone structures. It will have to be something, more specific to dirt archaeology and artifacts, where more data can be amassed to look into the questions that need to be looked into. So I remember the craze when I was in college and people talking about Mystery Hill and so forth. And this is when Barry Fell was, his books had come out. So people were, thinking about these things, but, unfortunately, they were overshadowed by the Nazca lines and spacecraft coming down to create these things and so forth. So anyway, that's a field that really needs to be looked into, and you folks could have an important role in something like that. Other people relating to the Norse, there's ideas that the Norse might have had a sun crystal that allowed them to see through fog and enable them to navigate, the way they were doing their latitude sailing was by looking at noon at the height of the sun. So you can't do that in the North Atlantic fog. The weather's pretty bad often up there. So how are you going to be sure you're going west when you should be and not going off course? So they have found a few of these calcite crystals, and they're supposed to be able to see the sun through the fog, but I don't think any experiments have ever shown that was really possible. And another find was this sundial, which was a wooden piece found in the Greenland Inuit site in West Greenland that has been proposed as a kind of a sundial that you would hand hold up with a spike in the middle, and in the shadow would give you some kind of information about latitudes and so forth. But it seems more likely that this artifact is a children's toy of a buzzer, with something that would just click as you hurl it around your head and so forth. Patricia Sutherland was curator of the National Museum in Ottawa, and she became famous in the 70s and 80s and early 90s for trying to show that the Norse culture had important impact on the Inuit cultures, particularly the Dorset culture. So Dorset culture was the Paleoeskimo original occupants of the Arctic until around 1400 AD. At which point they were overrun by the Thule culture, named from an excavation in Thule, Greenland, where they found the Alaskan people known as Thule culture now, dating to 12 and 1400 AD. And she tried a number of ways to show that the Dorset people were learning something from the Norse, and this had to do with fibers, which she thought were coming from wool. So in Paleoeskimo Dorset site, we found a lot of twine and rope. And it was actually, we discovered, made out of muskox hair, not out of cowhide or cow hair or something like that. And in this case, she went back to some excavations. Mauro Maxwell from the University of Michigan, and he had excavated a site in South Baffin Island. And among his collections, after he ceased his work, Southern found a soapstone that looked like a piece of a crucible. It was been identified as having some bronze and tin residue in it as well. So this is pretty interesting because the site is not known to be before, for the Dorset site is probably dating to the 12 to 1400s. It's possible that Norse and Dorset, and we do know that they were in touch and contact, traded ivory probably and so forth, but we don't know that they ever, passed any kind of bronze technology or high pyrotechnology to the Dorset people. So this is a mystery that is really we haven't figured out how to answer this question. Is it really a crucible or is it something else? Because the Eskimo people did a lot of work with soapstone, but not with tin and bronze residue. So it's a continuing issue. Then there's another claim about Vikings, which has been made by Sarah Parchak. Sarah got her degree at South Carolina, University of North Carolina, I think, and claimed to have found a Viking site, southwestern tip of Newfoundland at Point Roissy. And this was widely publicized and so forth. She found the site from remote archaeology using satellite images. And so she looked around for things where you found linear structures in the soil that might indicate a Viking longhouse. And where this red arrow, shows there is a slight double parallel line that she thought might be the remains of a Viking longhouse. This is an entirely crazy idea because the Point Roissy, as you see from the satellite photograph here, it's nothing but a high, steep bank of eroded, limestone and sediments. No place, no harbor, no place to put a boat ashore, nothing like that. And if there's one thing the Vikings were going to do whenever they came in, they needed a harbor for their boat. And this wasn't the place. So it was a crazy place, but, there were professional excavations were done there that she participated in, and the Newfoundland provincial archaeology people were involved in, and they never found anything, but they did find nothing Norse, but they did find bog ore. And bog ore is the material that accumulates underneath peat in northern latitudes, and it can be used to make iron. And the smithy at the Lanceneto site was probably using bog ore to make iron, and there's good technical evidence for that work, being done from bog ore. It wasn't easy material to work with, but they had the technology to do it, and they remade nails for their Viking ships while they were there. So anyway, this took several years to get resolved. About the same time that I heard about this, actually a couple of years later, a fellow named Royce Haynes contacted me about a hypothesis he had that Torvald Eriksson, which is Leif Erikson's brother, who died in Labrador, his ship was wrecked somewhere in the Vinland area. We don't know where, but Royce got convinced. He was a naval engineer, naval architect, very competent in remote sensing and things like that. So he did a lot of careful remote sensing work and came up with the idea that some markings he found at the bottom of Pistolet Bay might be the remains of Torvald's ship. And he read the sagas very carefully. He was retired. And he was a very systematic, thoughtful guy. I had a lot of email exchanges with him. And he was very, it was a great connection. And he was not like some other people who were trying to make a name for themselves. He was just really trying to make a contribution. Unfortunately, it was so. This is where he thought, Torvald had sailed down from northern Newfoundland and got into this place and began to have trouble later on. But this is the northern Newfoundland site area. He was, when he published this map in his report, he wanted to remind everybody that they shouldn't use this chart for marine navigation because it was not an official chart. So he was very concerned that wanted to try to do everything properly. And here's where he found that he thinks that Torvald's boat was hit a reef outside this harbor area and then brought their boat in to fix it and brought it up on the beach. And you see the parallel lines where he found, he had this whole story constructed. Here's the reef, and he did the underwater kind of hydrography for the whole thing. Very systematic and careful. And then on the left, you see the sort of stripes in the ground. This is tundra country. And that's where he thought the ribs of Torvald's boat, had come to rest. And it was a very carefully constructed argument, but what he hadn't been able to do is ground truth, really, to talk to people in the local area, because if he had done that, he would found out that people bring their boats up to these kind of places all the time for the winter. They haul them ashore, and they often put cribs down for putting their boats on over the winter time, and then haul them off again, and so the cribs lie in the ground below. So, well-meaning guy who then got into a long conversation with the provincial archaeology people because he tried to convince them to see if they would help him do a professional archaeological dig here and figure out what are these things. But he got the runaround from the Newfoundland people, and because they were convinced that this couldn't be a true thing, and just blew him off, kind of. So it ended up in this kind of a sad way. And I know a lot of people, you people who are not professional archaeologists, have trouble getting a permit to do some archaeology because you don't have a degree. Well, the controllers are out there, and they really are concerned that somebody who's qualified archaeologist do this. And Royce actually had a archaeologist willing to work with him, but in the end the guy backed out, because he was afraid for his career or something like that. So this kind of archaeology is really difficult to do because it's real stuff that needs to be investigated. It can't be done by people without professional degrees and proper permits and things like that. And so some ideas are out there and need to be tested, but can't because you can't find a professional person who are able to do it or willing to do it or something. So it's kind of a conundrum. It's kind of a sad story. And I really respect Royce for working as hard as he did, even though I thought it was kind of a crazy project. Here's some of his other notations about what he thought he saw from the remote sensing equipment. And another one here, there's these parallel lines and so forth. So we've had a lot of trouble with Norse and Dorset archaeology. Dorset people, as I mentioned, were around 1300. A guy named Tom Lee, who got a PhD from the University of Michigan and went to Ottawa, worked for the National Museum for a while, got interested in northern Quebec, did some archaeology, and found a site, you see in the black and white shot, full of rocks, a longhouse site. He found a few Dorset tools in it. He thought it was a longhouse. He dug it and reconstructed it as a longhouse and promoted it for the field. And it created quite a sensation in the 60s. Until Patrick Plumet, a French archaeologist who had worked with Tom Lee, took on the job and excavated the whole site and found out, the Dorset people actually had longhouses themselves. So this is the Dorset site that was just misidentified because Tom Lee was a pretty obstinate character, and he was, he ended up with he didn't get forward in his career in that way, let me tell you. There's another interesting problem about Dorset and Thule is the Sadlermuir. In 2000, around 1900, when, well, in the mid 1800s, really, the whalers started doing a lot of work in Hudson Bay. And they met a lot of people on the west coast of Hudson Bay. Among them were people known as the Saddler-Mute. And the Saddler-Mute were thought to be a Thule group that somehow was isolated on Southampton Island, which is kind of like out in the middle of Hudson Bay. They didn't have very much connection with the whalers. And in 1903, the tribe went extinct when people arrived the next summer and discovered everybody was dead except for a woman and 4 children. And they'd all died of disease as introduced by the whalers. And in the 1930s, or sorry, the 1950s, my predecessor at the Smithsonian, Henry Collins, decided to excavate on Southampton Island to see if he could figure out the origin of the Dorset culture. Were they Thule people? Were they different from Thule? And had they had any mixing with Thule and so forth? And he excavated some Saddler-Mute houses. You see a picture of one earth house down here, and in them they found all this stone technology, fairly well done, and looking a little bit like Dorset tools. So those of us who know the Dorset technology pretty well recognize that these tools don't really look like Dorset tools. The Dorset people didn't live until 1900. They became extinct around 1300 or 1400, but the idea was maybe some group persisted and kept on, and were then influenced by the incoming Thule culture from Alaska, starting around 1300 AD. And this has been a real problem for a long time. People have tried to investigate whether the Thule people annihilated the previous Dorset population in the Eastern Arctic, throughout the Eastern Arctic, or whether some amount of Dorset people, or their culture continued into the Thule culture. And I was a proponent of that idea for a while, because one of the major harpoon types that the Thule people used was basically like a copy of a Dorset tool. And so we thought that, maybe there is some kind of some number of Dorset people persisted into the Thule culture, particularly maybe the children and the women. The Dorset people were very shy and seemed to have been very skittish, and when a number of times have been history of contact, the Thule people, and probably the Dorset people too, would drown themselves or throw themselves off cliffs to kill themselves rather than be captured by other people. They were so afraid of what would happen to them at that point. But we thought that maybe some women and children were taken into Thule culture, and that's how this happened. But we've just had one of my students has done a big study of the Saddler-Mute now. And we've looked at Henry Collins' collections that ended up at the Smithsonian. And we discovered that the stone tools that they were using that looked like Dorset tools were copies of Dorset tools that they found when digging their houses, because the Dorset people had lived in these same spots. Saddler-Mute came in and started digging up the house pits and making their own houses, incorporating some of these tools, perhaps in their deposits and so forth. In any case, they knew about the Dorset technology, and since there is no chert there's no slate on Southampton and Coates Island, it looks like the Thule people were using the Dorset tools as models to create a flaking technology that they'd never used before. And we're doing a pretty good job of it, so that it confused archaeologists for a long time. So, and now there's been new genetic evidence that shows that there's no Dorset component in the genome of the Thule people. So we're pretty sure that this picture of this lonely Inuit guy, Saddler-Mute guy, paddling inflated walrus skin to meet George Lyons back in the early 1800s is really a story of a people living in a very isolated place who were Thule people, but had a hard time surviving, and eventually adopted stone tool technology as a way to manage their culture until they died from European diseases and so forth. So it shows you how difficult sometimes it can be to interpret the result of a culture being replaced by another one. In this case, we finally figured out what the probable solution is. Another issue, when I began my work in the north, I had worked with Elmer Hart in Dartmouth, and Elmer had done some work in Newfoundland and southern Labrador and had found these artifacts made out of this translucent quartzite chert. It's really a recrystallized chert. It's not a full quartzite with these black stripes in it and so forth. It was known from Newfoundland and New England in the main boarhead sites. Occasionally, these artifacts were found of Ramah chert. And so I was curious, could we find where its origin is? And eventually, within about 5 or 6 years, we discovered that it was coming from a quarry way up in the northern part of Labrador. And you can see this quarry bowl area on the lower right here. It's a fabulous material, and it's been, traded south, especially in the late Archaic period. It shows up in the Moorhead red paint grades around 4,000 to 3,000 years ago in Newfoundland and in Maine. And Darren Lowry has found articles made out of Ramah chert as far south as Virginia and Maryland and so forth. So this material was a really remarkable flakeable material, and was available in huge amounts in the geological beds in northern Labrador. And we found a site halfway down the Labrador coast. It looks like a place where Indians who were coming from the Ramah Bay with big chunks of this chert were sitting down, chipping it to make it get into smaller bifaces, blanks that they could take south from there. And I think next summer or the next, we hope to go up and excavate more of the site. It's the only kind of reduction site that we have for Ramah chert anywhere. But Stephen Loring has done a wonderful job in identifying this material, having technical chemical studies done. And this is because in the film, the last time you saw him talking about this fluted point from the Champlain seashore. And this is the picture of that fluted point made out of Ramah chert. We couldn't figure out how are Paleoindian people, 10, 11,000 years ago, getting to northern Labrador and coming home with Ramah chert. Could it be ice transported, or could it be, how else could it get overland? The whole peninsula was full of ice. So it's a real conundrum, and it almost certainly had to come by a boat. So now we are pretty sure that Paleo people, got to the Ramah quarries, although we've never found any other paleo material on the Labrador coast. But it would be on the highest possible beaches that you could ever hope to find. Here's some of the main boarhead sites. Occasionally, these artifacts were found of Ramah chert. And so I was curious, could we find where its origin is? And eventually, within about 5 or 6 years, we discovered that it was coming from a quarry way up in the northern part of Labrador. And you can see this quarry bowl area on the lower right here. It's a fabulous material, and it's been, traded south, especially in the late Archaic period. It shows up in the Moorhead red paint grades around 4,000 to 3,000 years ago in Newfoundland and in Maine. And Darren Lowry has found articles made out of Ramah chert as far south as Virginia and Maryland and so forth. So this material was a really remarkable flakeable material, and was available in huge amounts in the geological beds in northern Labrador. And we found a site halfway down the Labrador coast. It looks like a place where Indians who were coming from the Ramah Bay with big chunks of this chert were sitting down, chipping it to make it get into smaller bifaces, blanks that they could take south from there. And I think next summer or the next, we hope to go up and excavate more of the site. It's the only kind of reduction site that we have for Ramah chert anywhere. But Stephen Loring has done a wonderful job in identifying this material, having technical chemical studies done. And this is because in the film, the last time you saw him talking about this fluted point from the Champlain seashore. And this is the picture of that fluted point made out of Ramah chert. We couldn't figure out how are Paleoindian people, 10, 11,000 years ago, getting to northern Labrador and coming home with Ramah chert. Could it be ice transported, or could it be, how else could it get overland? The whole peninsula was full of ice. So it was a real conundrum, and it almost certainly had to come by a boat. So now we are pretty sure that Paleo people, got to the Ramah quarries, although we've never found any other Paleo material on the, on the Labrador coast. But it would be on the highest possible beaches that you could ever hope to find. Here's some of the artifacts from the late Maritime Archaic site of Al's Bight. This is a big bight-faced blade that's that long, and it was found in the Nuliac grave, broken into 3 pieces. And then there are points made out of it, and scrapers and other things. And then in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, the North Shore, a guy digging up his garden one day came across a whole stack of Ramah chert blanks buried about a foot down in his garden. Apparently, a cache left by some people who were trading Ramah, who had not come back to collect it at some point. There were maybe 30 of these Ramah chert bifaces. So it shows you, this is like 4,000 to 3,500 years ago. Actually, amend that. I'm sorry. There is a big maritime archaic trade in the material, but these blanks look like they're from the Middle Woodland period, probably around 1200. And this is the time when Ramah spreads down into the northeastern cultures along the coast here. So there's, at that time, 1,000 years ago, a lot of Ramah chert was being traded by Indians down the Labrador coast, probably just before the Thule people, showed up in Labrador. A pretty fantastic trade commodity and story. So another one of these mysteries was the Viking mystery, the Viking boat. Artists had pictured in the lower left, scenes with Eric the Red going to Greenland in what looks like a bathtub. Not a likely way to cross the North Atlantic, but the Gokstad ship was excavated in the 1880s, and all of a sudden the idea of what a Norse boat might have looked like became, popular and evident. And Oseberg, this fantastic burial ship with Queen Asa and all this amazing material that was preserved in her burial, that was found, 20 years later. So Gokstad was the model for the ship that crossed the North Atlantic. Captain Anderson sailed it to Chicago, and it was seen at the World's Fair. And the irony is that in the Bayeux tapestries, from the 1070s era, anybody could have seen exactly what a Norse boat looked like, from these amazing tapestry illustrations. So it just shows you how how some archaeological evidence, gets buried and forgotten about when all sorts of speculation of crazy stuff, occurs. I did a big exhibit on the Vikings in the year 2000, which was the 1000th anniversary of the Norse discovery of the Americas. The Scandinavians came over to the Smithsonian and said, "Hey, we have an anniversary coming up, and we'd like to do an exhibit." And I said, "Well, I'm the guy," and I pulled out my Viking credentials from my family history going back to Normandy and stuff like that. And anyway, it was a chance for me to explore what a little bit of my own roots were in this ancient history and stuff. And so I led this big project with, a lot of Americans and Canadians and Danes and Swedes and Finns and others to produce the big Viking show that we had at the Smithsonian, traveled all around North America. And it was going to travel in Russia until the Russian Empire failed in the early 90s. And so we couldn't get the site over there. It would have been great to have it travel, because we were working a lot with the Russian curators too on things like this. And supposedly somebody from the President Grimson of Iceland said, oh, I know Vladimir Putin, he will do this for us. Little did he know what would happen a few decades later. But this is the astrometric picture of the North Atlantic. So you see the North Atlantic drift, the warm waters from the Gulf Stream coming up on the coast of Norway, and even a little bit in West Greenland, which was fueling the grass growth that enabled the Norse to go to Greenland and have their animals survive. And on the other side, you had the cold water coming out of the Greenland, East Greenland, and down the coast of Baffin and Labrador to Newfoundland. So you could have, Vikings having a very fine time up in the high Norway area, but, not being able to survive way down on the far, far to the south in Newfoundland because of the influence of the Labrador current. And so that was really the big problem for the Norse. As soon as the little ice age began around 1300, they couldn't keep their animals fed properly, and the colonies dwindled. So it's a good example of the fragility of operating, trying to operate a farming system at the fringes of the temperature regimes that could make it possible. As soon as the regime changed, they began to have serious trouble, and the last Norse left Greenland probably early in the 1500s. But all through that period, there have been connections with Labrador because some of the Iceland records, church records, showed that there were a lot of there were voyages that were coming from Greenland to Vinland to pick up timber, and so they were coming to Labrador because there was no source of wood for their boats or for their houses, and occasionally they get blown offshore to Iceland. So we knew that there were connections that lasted for a long time. And you can trace them, this is how you would trace their migration through these artifact types like the ring pin and the sword, shield, and cruciform ornaments and things like that. You could track these artifact types across the North Atlantic, and several of them ended up in the Viking site in Newfoundland, which gave us a very certain idea, as well as the longhouses, that they had come from Greenland or Iceland. Here's the Lancemeadows site with the three houses, probably the result, the people who travel in three different boats from Iceland to from Greenland, and the sod houses that are distinctive of that culture, and so forth. And some of the artifacts that come from the Vinland excavations, the woodworking, the green pin, the spindle whorl, a soapstone spindle whorl. They found a wonderful pot or lamp, rather, in the smithy at Lancemeadows, and that's basically it's a Dorset, a late Dorset lamp, which the Vikings must have picked up visiting a late Dorset site in Labrador, and that ended up on the floor of the smithy. So that was interesting. And above it is the butternuts, which probably you've heard about, which were excavated from the Lancemeadows site. And butternuts don't grow in northern Newfoundland and only in really New Brunswick area. So this is a support for the idea that Vinland was kind of a way station for exploring the Vinland region, which would have been the whole area of the Gulf of St. Lawrence area in northern Nova Scotia. Two other artifacts are interesting not from the Vinland sites. One is this Ramah chert point, which was found in a graveyard in Saint Ness in Western Greenland, and it's typologically dates to around 1000 AD in an Indian culture. It's not a Dorset piece, or certainly not Thule or anything. It's a side notch point similar to ones that you find in the ancient Beothic sites and so on. And this was found not in a grave, but in the Bacter when the 1930s excavations were happening in Greenland in the Norse cemeteries there. And they excavated a grave, and then in the Bacter nearby was found this notched point. And so there's the report in the sagas about Thorvald Eriksson being killed by an Indian arrow, by a Skraeling arrow. And so, there's a good possibility that this was carried back with Thorvald's body and put in the ground, and then was later found as the artifact which killed him. And the other is the Norse penny found in the Goddard site in Maine, which is dating to 1070s and 1080s. It's the Olaf Kira penny, which he was a Viking leader of that time period. And it was found in a site in the Goddard site. And the amateurs who dug that site kept the piece in a shoebox in a cigar box along with the arrowheads and stuff, until it was later given to the Maine State Museum, and they had somebody look at it and say, "This looks like a Norse penny." And it was then verified as probably a trade good that came from Labrador or Newfoundland down to the Goddard site in Penobscot Bay as a part of an Indian trade system that was going on. So this is an interesting piece because somehow, we didn't imagine that Norse people were kicking around Labrador or Newfoundland as late as 1080. We figured that they probably quit after Leif Erikson, in the 20s or something like that. So here's something that shows that, in fact, verifies the stories of the continuing voyages to Markland, which is Labrador, to obtain timber and things like that for the Norse settlements. When I started my working with Elmer Harp, I went to Hudson Bay with him and dug a Lake Dorset site in the east coast of Hudson Bay, and I found this copper pendant, which I didn't think much of at the time, being a graduate student and all, and I just thought, a piece of metal. Elmer had it looked at. It turns out it's European copper, and was found in the 1300s Dorset site in Hudson Bay, indicating some kind of trade systems between the Norse and the Dorset people. And there's I mentioned the coin and the Ramah chert coin, and the other really interesting piece is this figurine from a Baffin Island site around 1350, south on the north side of Hudson Strait, which is showing it's only about that big. It's maybe 4 inches tall, made out of wood, and it's a cloak. It's wearing a long garment, and there's a kind of a cross inscribed on the chest. So this looks very much like it was a European, certainly not a native or Thule or Dorset dress. So somebody has seen a Norse person and made a small carving to represent it. So that's really interesting. Direct contact. And up in the upper right is this piece of wood that has been recently identified as dating to 1021 AD, based on solar alterations in dendrochronology. So what happens is when there's a big solar burst, it makes a signal in the growth rings of wood. And so some very interesting people, Copens from Belgian area, had this idea of looking for wood from the Lansing Meadows site, looked through all their collections and found a piece, had it sampled, and it came out to be the solar burst. One of them occurred around, I think it was 980, 990 or something like that. And there was a bunch of rings, that allowed them to date the cutting of this piece of wood to 1021. So pretty interesting discovery. We now know that at least the Norse were still in Lansing Meadows in the 1020 time period. Some other Norse finds from Arctic sites. You can see the red dots. These are all Norse artifacts found in Dorset or Thule sites in high Arctic. So that's where the action was. And they found one site up in northern Ellesmere Island, Peter Schleiderman dug, was full of Norse material, including a piece of chain mail, knives, a carpenter's plane, and from a nearby site came a bronze balance arm from a trade balance. Pretty interesting idea, with Norse trying to do trade with a balance arm with some Inuit people, and a bronze pot fragment and so forth. So just to say that there was a lot of contact. Some of it might have been violent, some of it might have been trade. What the Norse were interested in was ivory, and they wanted to get ivory from the local Inuit people, Dorset people, or Thule people who were really good walrus hunters. And ivory was in hot demand in Europe at that time. A couple of centuries later, the ivory trade died because elfin ivory from Africa became available in Europe. And so the transatlantic push for ivory trade and the big commodity to keep the Greenland colonies economically viable, dropped out at the same time that the weather got cold. So they had a double problem, which was dooming their settlement. So this is just the last piece I wanted to show you. I've been working for the last 15 years on the northeastern coast of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And I initially went there to see if I could figure out how far the Eskimo cultures penetrated to the south into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And we knew that the Dorset people had occupied fully all of Newfoundland at one point. And we knew that they were present at least in some parts of the Gulf, but we didn't really know. So we discovered that a lot of the maritime archaic Indian cultures, were present in the northern Gulf, that Dorset people rarely got beyond the Strait of Belle Isle. And the Thule people, starting around 1600, were attracted into this region because of the presence of the Basques. So the Basque whalers learned how to hunt whales in the Bay of Biscay in the 1300s, 1400s. As soon as Newfoundland was discovered, the Basques sent whaling ships over to Newfoundland and began whaling around 1525, and all big fleets, maybe as many as 60 Basque whaling ships would be present in that area. And so Red Bay became one of the major whaling centers on the southern coast of Labrador near Newfoundland. And that's where Parks Canada, Robert Grenier from Canada, excavated this San Juan ship, a Basque ship that sank with all its gear and everything. And they resurrected that. They excavated every plank in that boat and brought it up to a barge and drew it and documented it and then resunk it and so forth. And meanwhile, Jim Tuck at Memorial University was doing work on the onshore stuff in Red Bay and was excavating Basque, the furnaces and the cooper's carpenter's shop where they were assembling barrels and things. But no one had really looked into the possibility that the Basque people were connecting with the Inuit. And we discovered that there are Inuit sites all along the north shore of the Gulf. As many as 5 villages with 2 or 3 houses in each village. And one of these was this site on the picture here, which is called Macatana. And here we found Basque structures and Inuit structures side by side. We found Inuit soapstone pots and lamp fragments on a Basque cookhouse floor, indicating women present, probably manning a Basque cookhouse or a wash house facility of some kind. We found an Inuit house buried under a Basque blacksmith shop, and the Inuit house had been burned, probably with people inside it. We found piles of what looked like bone ash, and we found a child's bow and a girl's small toy lamp. And then another house that was full of an Inuit house that was full of Basque material culture, pottery and lots of iron and axes and all sorts of stuff. And it was very, very interesting because it looked like this is not material that the Inuit people could have collected from scavenged and Basque sites or something like that. They had to be working on site together. So we have this really pretty solid evidence now that the Basque and the Inuit, at least for a short period of time, were doing a joint venture. The Basques were whaling. At the time, the Inuit had a better whaling technology than the Basques, because the Basques were still hunting whales with these big, barbed, arrows on harpoons, but not toggling harpoons that turned sideways like the Eskimo harpoons would. So it looks like they were collaborating in some way, getting a lot of material. They're probably serving as safeguards when the Basques left every year to go home in the wintertime, somebody had to stay protecting the sites from their boats, their chaloops and other things. And it looks like this is what the Inuit, took on. And it didn't work out well for them because all of the records indicate that the combination of the French and the Inuit, and they got together and basically pushed the Inuit people out of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, mostly by the early 1600s, or later in that century anyway. So there was an experiment, and it looked like the Inuit people traveled south during the cold period of the little ice age. They found in the south, they found the Basques and adapted to their culture, and got along okay for a while until the environment changed for them, and they basically had to retreat after a lot of losses of life and so forth. And they stayed back and went back into Labrador, northern Labrador. And then starting in the mid-1900s, they began returning as a new wave of Inuit population. And this time they were successful and settled among some of the villages together with the Europeans on the North Shore of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So anyway, that's a kind of a rundown of about a bunch of different things that have happened in the North, questions that we still have, and questions that have been answered, some of the craziness that has happened. I was on a couple of cruises up into that country, and this Norse legacy continues to inspire serious interest or amusement or whatever. There are a lot of Scandinavian Americans in North America and Canada, and everybody loves to think about the time when the Norse were here, and they didn't stay very long, and their colony in Greenland was over by early 1500s. Anyway, I'd be happy to answer questions. Thank you very much for inviting me and your attention. And I really have enjoyed the time I've been here. I've been very impressed by the talks and the quality of the data and the dedication and so forth. So wish the best for Dura in the future. And I'd love to keep in touch, with you.
If there are any questions, I have one actually. I've heard that copper pendant for Richmond, I'm sure, has been paid for, but I know I can think of the first American thing that's
I was pretty green at the time. Elmer Harp was there, 2 or 3 others. The site was in Gulf Hazard, right at the narrow entrance of Richmond Gulf. And at the time this thing was found, we had no idea that it came from. We just assumed somehow they've got a hold of some native copper or something like that. No, not just like that, but in the Belcher Islands, there is a find from a Thule site of a pendant that sort of is like it. It looks like a triangular with a heart shape, kind of shape to it anyway. Made out of metal. It might also be copper. No one can find that piece, unfortunately. Yeah.
Any questions?
Yes.
The Ramah chert. You've shown a lot of individual pieces. Is that actually embedded in Baker's last now?
Yeah, it occurs as a 6-foot bed across 30 miles.
Oh.
And at the Torngat in that area of the stratified series of rocks, and there's a one strata that goes along for 30 miles that is the Ramah bed. It's not all the highest quality, but and in the talus slopes below this bed, because the glaciers have carved these fjords out, and so you go down the talus slope and you can pick this stuff up easy. It's amazing. We brought home chunks like that. The name of this material in the Inuit terminology is kitchigak, and kitchigak means the back fat of the caribou, which is what it looks like, kind of grayish, marbled, and so that's the name they gave to it.
What does one call it?
Yeah, it's unbelievable. So you can see it appears first in the early Maritime Archaic sites about starting around 6,000 years ago. So at least at that point, people had gone north of the forest to discover these beds, and then ever since then, that time, they kept going up there until the first Inuit showed up around 4,000 years ago. Yeah.
One is when we showed the sacrificial stone. Any reason that can be used for a fur or any hunting or,
One reference. Yeah.
The question for
The question is the so-called sacrificial stone. I guess Mr. Hill. I've heard different explanations. You people would know what the real explanation is. It's been described as a sagger press or a lye leaching thing to somehow dealing with bleaching with lye or something. Does anybody have a real knowledge about that? What the current idea about that big flat stone is?
Chuck run that in one of his recent books, and he couldn't come to a conclusion. He compared it to the known press and why stones from across the mainland, and it's still unresolved.
But it has a channel to drain something off it. Yeah, right. I don't think. Yeah, I don't think that's been proposed.
Name, but Seattle has a museum. It basically has to do with a very large movement of peoples from a Scandinavian background down into what's now the United States from Canada. They were living in various areas of Canada and also going more southerly into Canada. Are you familiar with that museum?
Well, yes, I know. That's the Burke Museum. I think that's the Burke Museum, University of Seattle. I mean, University of Washington in Seattle. They have, they have a lot of Scandinavians, in Seattle area and in Alaska. And there's a big, Scandinavian population there. But it's not. There's no migration, north or south or anything like that.
Red, that very of people in Scandinavia. I live in New York, and I have several friends. One was from Minnesota, and somebody else from Western New York, and their grandparents were part of this immigration.
No, my son works at the University of Washington out there, and so I'm pretty familiar with the history. I mean, there's been a lot of Scandinavian people who moved to Seattle in the last century. A lot of them became fishermen and work up in Alaska with boats, and they bring their boats back to Seattle. A lot of them. There's quite a few Scandinavians who ended up in Vancouver also, but there's no big, like recent migration. Of course, in the ancient times, there was, people did come down that coast, from the Paleoindian period and down the coast, probably all the way to South America.
This recent, but maybe 100 years ago.
Not that I know of. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk, Phil. It was great. If the small wooden figure with the cross on it from Baffin Island, is that on display in any museum? Is there?
It must be on display, I imagine, at the museum in Ottawa, the Museum of History, because that's where they own the piece, so forth. I've always questioned whether there's actually a cross on that. It's not a very purposeful thing. It's more of a scratch, And this is, some people like to think this is an image of the Knights Templar that may have somehow, come over to explore, during the Viking period or in sometime, after that. I think it's just a Norse tunic, and a guy wearing a tunic. It's a beautiful little piece.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Early on, you mentioned the comparison of the stone toolkits from,
Scandinavia and Labrador.
right, said it's likely convergence rather than.
Yeah.
But what would be the indication that it was more than convergence, that it actually was?
So what for that we would look for specific typological parallels. For instance, when Thule culture starts in Alaska and expands into Canada around 1300, there's a very specific set of artifacts that come with that migration. And as I showed you in the Viking case, when they migrated across the North Atlantic, the ring pin, the cruciform cross, the sword shield, and various other things came with it. So anytime there's a migration, you have to look at the chronology. Does that work? You have to look at the implements. You have to look at the settlement patterns and so forth. And if all of those things make sense, there's a good argument you can make for a specific migration. So there's been quite a lot of theorizing in anthropology about what does it take to identify a migration, and those are some of the 4 elements. So you'd expect then to find some artifacts of the same slate used in Scandinavia but not available in North America. Specific types, like the ulu types for seal cleaning and so forth, were a slightly different form than occurred in the Thule culture and so forth. So it's just, and that beautiful banded, sort of green and tan banded slate in the Scandinavian stuff doesn't occur, on our side of the Atlantic and never shown up. So quite specific elements.
Anything else?
Last chance. Ben.
Do the Royce names work, or did we have publication, or even if it's not necessarily what?
It's Harris. The last name is Harris. Royce, Royce, Harris, Harris.
Okay.
You know if anything's ever published or a website created or anything like that?
There is some websites out there, but not that are definitive in any way. It's mostly tourist kind of material. So I think I'm glad you knew the answer to the question of how did you get that. Well, yeah.
One last one. So what is the southernmost extent of the Maritime Archaic?
It really it occurs in 2 types. 3 types really. There's one type that's called collectively called the Red Paint culture in Maine. It's like the late Archaic, 3,500-year-old culture in Maine. In Newfoundland, it's the Newfoundland Archaic, and then Labrador, the Labrador Maritime Archaic. But it was very closely tied to sea mammal hunting and fishing. Must have had large slate gouges, as is some of those beautiful ground stone plummets that they used for net sinkers, things like that. And, when you get down to southern Maine and Boston area, that stops, So it's something to do with the cold water. Like the Gulf of Maine in that time was pretty cold water. So seals, maybe even harp seals were available and so forth. So there's probably a strong ecological boundary that occurs in southern Maine at that time, 4,000 years ago, that allowed a lot of that cold North Atlantic water to come down that far, bringing the animals. And so that became the whole kind of culture distribution for that stuff.
They know evidence that they made it out of the river.
They did come up the rivers, and some of the biggest cemeteries, red paint cemeteries, have been found up the Kennebec and various other rivers. That's where the term red paint people began, because of the excavation of these burial pits that contained, bone. They were called the Great Boneless Cemeteries of Maine, because the acidic soils had gobbled up the human remains, but left all the tools and red paint and stuff. And people would put amazing materials into those graves. I mean, very, very beautifully made large objects, and slate daggers for sword fishing and so forth. So yeah, a lot of the biggest cemeteries are in the lower river valleys, but not very far up, maybe up 10 miles or 15 miles. And then, of course, what happened is a lot of the sites that were occupied at that time had been along the shore, and the sea levels kept rising and rose over those sites. So now the coast of Maine, it's hard to find any sites on the coast of Maine that are older than 3,000 years because they've all been swamped and they're underwater.